So let's continue our discussion on agriculture, specifically organic agriculture versus, let's call it chemically, or and some folks might call it conventionally produced food. Um, a lot of what the USDA regulations do is talk about what you can't do. In other words, what substances you can't use, what things can't you do to have something be labeled organic. And it's not necessarily addressing so much what you can do, which I think is where perhaps the philosophy of organic standards may have gotten lost, because really I think what people are trying to do with organic agriculture is to utilize the system to the best of its ability to regulate itself naturally. So in other words, using things like crop rotation, planting more than one crop within the same area, trying to use natural predators as much as possible to get rid of pests, things like that. Optimize growing conditions so that the crops actually able to take advantage of the soil and the different water resources that are there. And that was a let's call it a grassroots sort of movement that, let's face it, organic farming has been around forever. As Charlie Barra of Barra Vineyards said, he was organic, he just didn't know better because they couldn't afford any chemicals or pesticides when he was a kid to put on their fields. So, clearly this is how things have been done for a long time, but we then sort of put some top-down prohibitions, or the USDA made those rules that, again, like I said, focused a lot more on what can't be done rather than on what really organic actually is. Let's also return to our discussion about feeding the world, or the population by 2050. And there were a lot of well-reasoned and nicely thought-out points of view. And many of you touched on things that many experts agree to be true, like we don't have a food production problem, we do have a food distribution problem. And those reasons for that distribution could be corrupt governments in countries where the food is needed, poor transportation facilities, poor distribution facilities, corporate control over food supply. All of those things are probably, well, let's call them absolutely true. There's not necessarily scientific consensus on whether we can or cannot feed the population with available resources. I will lean in the camp that we can, but I am certainly not a scientist. I'm a chef, and so I rely on all the same sources that you folks do to make what I hope are educated decisions, because what I do as a chef affects other people, my diners, people who look to chefs as influencers of policy, or people who look to chefs as somebody who kind of points the right way about what to do about food. So I keep that in mind, but also recognize the limitations of my own scientific knowledge. Central to this debate, I think, is a question of whether people have a right to food. Now that sounds laughable when we think about it, but we should take some time to examine what we feel about that. Clearly we all need food to live. Now we can go without for some time, we can go with little for quite some time, but we all have to eat in order to survive. And so, if we're talking about a global right to food, what we're really discussing is whether or not we feel that people in other areas of the world have a right to live. At least that's the way that I see it. Now, if we feel that people in other areas of the world have less of a right to live than we do, or no right to live, then from there that argument flows that maybe everybody does not deserve food. Um, I don't believe, well, I shouldn't speak for the class. Maybe we should see what everybody else feels about that. My own feeling is that, yes, everybody has a right to life, and if they have a right to life, then they have a right to food. Another aspect of that feeding the world population by 2050 is that as countries develop further, they put in more infrastructure, more roads, more schools, more hospitals, more housing. All of those things take away from available agricultural land. So the question is, again, will we have enough land to grow enough food to feed that population? And if we don't, is there anything that can be done about that? So, if we're talking about the scientific applications of agriculture, we must bring up genetic engineering, which produces things called GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Now, many of you may know that Mendocino County was the first county to outlaw or ban the growth of GMOs. Other counties have since followed suit, but we were certainly the leader in that. And GMOs are an emotional and touchy subject. Now, I'm going to caution you, I am no scientist. I've said that already. But I want to reiterate that. And as far as I can tell from the roster, none of you are either. So we are going to examine the science of GMOs and the claims of GMOs, both for and against, to really try to educate ourselves. Our discussion this week, I would like you each to take a position both for and against GMOs. Now, those of you in the anti-GMO camp, please keep an open mind and consider that your emotions might be clouding your judgment. Those of you who are pro-GMO, keep that same thing in mind and really try to see both sides of this issue with as clear a lens as we possibly can. There are many former environmentalists, or, well, let's not say former environmentalists, but just call them environmentalists, who believe that genetic modification is the way that we are going to achieve feeding the world with minimal impact, while there are others who believe that that is simply not the case. Like many issues, this is going to be incredibly complicated, and I don't know that we have a clear-cut right or wrong answer that doesn't, to some degree, rely on our gut feeling or on our emotions about this issue. Not to say that gut feelings and emotions are not valuable, they certainly are. But when we are trying to evaluate scientific fact, or at least scientific hypothesis, or wading through scientific literature, for those of us with a non-science background, it can be difficult, it can be complicated, and it is much easier to look for the quick soundbite on Facebook, or the meme that your friend might send you that sums everything up in 2 simple points. But our reality is a bit more complicated than that. So in the discussion forums, I'd like to see us really dig into this topic, and I will post some videos and some links for resources as well. So let's go ahead and get started with that.